All right, welcome everyone. The topic that we're going to discuss tonight is the question of whether or not it is permitted for Jews to enter into, and there's two parts to this question, enter into a non-Jewish religious space. And I'm purposely saying that vaguely, meaning that to say just church doesn't capture this whole conversation, and specifically for non-religious events. We'll talk more about that, but there is certainly a distinction between me going into a church to vote in the municipal elections and me going into a Catholic church to get communion. One of them is definitely open to discussion, one of them not as much. However, before we get into it, there's two important things here. One is I want to be very sensitive, at least upfront, about this topic and recognize that I want to be sensitive to those of other religions and speak about this with respect. And B, also recognize that there are those who either on this call or will listen to this class who do go into churches to listen to concerts and go look at art and think, well, the rabbi said this or didn't say this, depending on how we end the class. But one of my really good friends who does a lot of interfaith made an interesting point. He said that certainly now in 2020, with interfaith conversations happening between different faiths and religions, the idea of one religion, i.e. Judaism, defining everyone and saying, you're idolatry or not idolatry, there's something very broken about that. Rather, each religion should speak for themselves. Now, that's a beautiful point in terms of creating darchei shalom and creating positive relations between faiths, as we should. However, from the perspective of Judaism, Judaism is a religion where we have to refrain from certain things. So it's not that we're defining other religions in the negative, it's that some things are permitted, some things aren't. And the second thing is there is a distinction, and I don't know if it's in these sources, but in other sources, between what's done and what's believed. Meaning that if we have a working definition of these are the actions that a religion does and they're defined as idolatry, even if their understanding, let's say, for example, the Trinity appears to be problematic. It appears like a religion believing in God has three different versions of God. It looks like having more than one God. But if you were to ask a Catholic, and again, this is not my expertise, but I've talked to others who say, no, it's three aspects of the one. And in Judaism, we have concepts like that. We have the Shekhinah, the presence of Hashem. So we have ideas like that. But Judaism is often more concerned with what we see than what goes on in people's heads. And that's important because we can't really get inside the minds of every single person of every other religion and see what they really deeply believe. So that's the first thing, is we should be sensitive, cognizant. However, in Judaism, we rule based on what we see in most cases. The second thing here is, even if we rule that it is forbidden to enter a space of idolatry, a side point that will come up in some of these sources is, when we mean idolatry, what do we mean? And there's kind of three ways to understand it. One is idolatry, worshiping idols, and that's just pure, unadulterated evil in and of itself. And anyone who does anything even similar to that is just, their heart is full of darkness. The second idea, and we perhaps get this idea from the Torah, from the beginning of the Ten Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, where it says, Anochi Hashem, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. Even though later in the Torah, it becomes clear that there are no other gods anywhere in the universe, that verse implies that there are other deities and perhaps other peoples can have other gods, and that's okay for them, but not for us. And there's two parts to that. One is the mitzvah of destroying idolatry doesn't apply in Milwaukee. It only applies in Israel. So perhaps it's not that idolatry or approaching God in a different, strange way, or at least different to Jewish, is not necessarily evil. It's just forbidden in the land of Israel. And then an idea that we'll see shortly down this list from a medieval commentary is that perhaps idolatry is only forbidden for Jews wherever they are, but not necessarily for non-Jews. And there might be a distinction between worshiping actual idols like statues and believing in God, but in a different way, i.e. something like the Trinity. But even though it's clear from the Torah that the idolatrous nations before the Israelites were evil, when we talk in these sources about other religions and we say that they may be idolatry or forbidden to go into their space, to partake in their services, etc., we don't necessarily have to assume that means these people are evil. Even if we find that it may not be permitted to listen to a concert in a church, that doesn't mean that that church, that what they're doing there is evil. It might just be a matter of what's forbidden to Jews. So that's a really important distinction to make at the beginning. So before we get into the sources, I want to ask if there are any questions, clarifications that people need just on that little introduction right there. Good. So the way I've structured this class is in two sections, two main sections. The first one is, if we rule a religion to be idolatrous or forbidden to Jews, what are the prohibitions on going into those spaces for non-religious events? The reason I say that is, as I clarified earlier, if a religion is not permitted to Jews, then going into their religious spaces to take part in their services is completely forbidden. And I can just pull verses out of the Torah, lehit rachek, you should distance yourself from it. It's just absolutely forbidden to participate in those services. We will see later an interesting source about being present in a space, and let's say a church, for example, an installation of a leader or a funeral of a great leader from another religion, not being part of the service, not standing, not singing along, but just being there out of respect, whether that's permitted. But actually participating, absolutely not. So our question here will really focus on entering the space and doing non-religious things like a concert, voting, taking a tour to see the artwork, etc. Section 1 is just about the prohibition, and it's assuming that we're talking about religions which are idolatrous. The second section will be the more, not necessarily controversial, but the more nuanced one, which is, what religions do we define as idolatrous? And the truth is, we would have to go religion by religion to do that. Years ago, one of my rabbis held a panel of leaders from different religions, including someone from Hinduism. And they were talking about what was the real belief around the statues they have. And they were trying to define if it was really idolatry. So I don't know the final ruling, but it certainly appeared to be, and I think that's ultimately what they found. But we're going to look at Islam and Christianity. But again, each religion deserves to be looked at individually, whether it's Jainism or Buddhism, or a list of different religions. But we're just going to look at the big two that are the most relevant for most of us, particularly Christianity. So without further ado, we're going to start with the earliest source that explicitly talks about not entering into spaces where idolatry takes place. And the reason I say that is the Torah made it very clear. In Israel, wipe out all idolatry, and certainly don't do it and don't lead anyone to do it. But what if you're not partaking in it and it's outside the land of Israel? You just want to walk through a town that they're having some idolatrous festival. So Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and ask you to take this first source from the Mishnah, which again is where all the conversations sort of take their cue from. Go for it.
When an idolatrous festival takes place within a city, it is permitted to conduct business with non-Jews outside it. If the idolatrous festival takes place outside it, business is permitted within it. Is it permitted to go there? If the road leads solely to that place, it is forbidden. But if one can go by it to any other place, it is permitted. A city in which an idolatrous festival is taking place, some of its shops being decorated and some not decorated, this was the case with Beth Shan, and the sages said, in the decorated stores, it is forbidden to buy, but in the undecorated ones, it is permitted.
Excellent. So there's a lot going on there, and particularly the matter about decorations. We're actually going to come back to that and the adornments that are on churches and other religious buildings. But there's a lot of ways to understand why we're not allowed to do this, because all it says is don't do it, don't do business with them. The simple understanding of this Mishnah is that the issue here is not necessarily that we will partake in idolatry directly ourselves. That's clear prohibition. We don't need a Mishnah to teach us that. The issue here is, let's say there's a festival in a small town, and that day they're selling all these delicious cakes and cookies, and all that money is going towards that festival to worship their false, idols. And if I were to go on that day and buy a bottle of water, which in and of itself is innocuous, that money would be going towards, in an indirect way, towards idolatry. So, but if I'm outside the city, maybe my money won't be as direct, but you'll see from the next few sources that the rabbis are actually not entirely certain, or they disagree out exactly what the issue is here. Again, the question is not me participating in these idolatrous acts, it's my association with them. And is it because I'm supporting them or other issues? And one other important thing to point out is the Mishnah here is from the tractate of, or the Seder, the order of Avodah Zarah. Literally means strange worship or service. There are multiple phrases in the Torah and in the writings for worshiping, for the religions other than Judaism. One of them, the most common, is Avodah Zarah. But by the way, Avodah Zarah, strictly speaking, means strange service. And the reason it's important to point that out is there might be a distinction between idol worship, which might be really, really bad, or a religion in which they do believe in the God of the Torah who created the universe, but the way that they worship that God is not permitted for the Jewish people. It's strange to the Jews. And again, that'll come up in a later source where we see a rabbi suggest, maybe it's okay for non-Jews to worship the one true God in this way, but not for Jews. But ultimately, our perspective here is it's all the same, whether it's in a different way of worshiping God than the way that we do it, or whether it's complete idolatry and worshiping statues. So we're going to go ahead on to the next source here. And Rashi here, and this is very important, and Rashi will come back again. He's kind of our key source. Why does he see it as being a problem to enter into these cities during their festivals? So Leonard and Gloria, I unmuted you. And Gloria, would you please take this Rashi commenting on that Mishnah?
If the road leads only to that place, there is no path out of that city that goes to another city. And the paved road from here to that city is only for that city alone. It's clear that anyone on that path is going to the idolatrous city. In that case, it's forbidden to take that path because of hashad, suspicion, that he's on the way to commit idolatry.
Excellent. Remember this source because it will be key to the rest of the class. If I am on the highway and I'm getting off at exit 74, which is, I think, Locust, I could be going to anywhere. Usually I'm going home when I get off at that exit. But what if exit 75 was specifically belonged to a Catholic church? They bought their own off-ramp and it went directly into their parking lot. Kind of like IKEA, like usually when you exit the off-ramp for IKEA, usually only going there. But if I got off at 75, anyone who saw me there could only think one thing: Rabbi Dinan's going to church. So Rashi says that the issue with this idolatrous city is not that I'm supporting their idolatry, but if someone sees me entering that city, there's only one thing that they can assume: that I'm going to commit idolatry. However, if I'm outside of that city, let's say they have regular sellers outside, and I go buy a bottle of water, like I said, from one of them on a road that goes past the city, because it's just, the city happens to be on the side of the road, then people think, oh, he's stopping for water. It's very similar. This concept we'll talk about later, Marit Ayin, what appears to the eye. If I go into a McDonald's and it's the only one on the side of the road for 100 miles on a very popular highway, people don't necessarily have to assume that I'm getting I don't know what foods they have there, a cheeseburger. People might think, oh, maybe he's just using the bathroom. So that is such an important concept, the chashad. And now the next, and so we're going to see two more suggestions here about what might be the issue. So number 3, from the Tosafot, the medieval commentaries, who again were mostly, or at least they were founded by the grandchildren of Rashi, suggest what we might have assumed. And Leonard, if you could take that one, please. Source number 3.
Tosafot Avodah Zarah 17b, being led astray. We see from here that it is normal to distance oneself from the doorstep of a house of idolatry as much as possible. See Avodah Baruha regarding the lesson that Tosfos is trying to teach us, that it is not stated in the Gemara. The Pasuk, Mishlei 5, number 8, indeed says, do not come close to the doorway of her house. And the Gemara earlier says this refers to idolatry. This is evident from the fact that he had more of an urge to go to the house of prostitution. The Maharam explains that they went that way instead of by the idols because it must have been forbidden to go by the idols. Otherwise, it is inappropriate to travel near prostitutes, even with intent of getting reward for holding back one's evil inclination.
Thank you. So this is a story from the Gemara, and it talks about two rabbis on the road, and there's a path that forks. One way goes to a house of idolatry, one goes to a house of ill repute, the oldest profession in the world. And the rabbis decide, without explaining their whole reasoning, to go to the house of ill repute. Now, Tosafot there implies in the end that perhaps they're going there because, you know, they're men, they have urges, and they literally want to stand outside, you know, look at the beautiful woman, and then get reward for saying, but I won't do anything. I won't go inside even though I'm tempted. That's Tosafot's suggestion, which might be. However, the takeaway here is that they would rather expose themselves to prostitution than to idolatry. And what the importance of this reason is that it's not that going into a house of idolatry is forbidden in and of itself. The rabbis were concerned, and that's what they ruled in the Mishnah, that if we go into there, that our hearts will be led astray. And that's, you know, the line from Proverbs, do not come close to the doorway of her house. And then Proverbs goes, all these other things not to expose oneself to. If you get too close to this, you might be led astray. So ultimately, we're going to come back to which of these three reasons the rabbis really run with. But this is certainly a concern. And the rabbis use this language throughout all contemporary Tshuvot, that there's a concern. If one does interfaith dialogue, it might lead them astray. Now, that's apart from whether or not that's true, but the rabbis have that concern. The third reason here, brought by the Rambam, the rabbis really don't run with this one, but they sometimes use the language of it. So let me just see who's next I have here on the video. Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and this will go on to the next page. Okay, so, and the Rambam suggests a third possible reason why going into a place of idolatry is forbidden. Go for it.
Sorry, my earphones got it in.
Oh, that's all right.
Unplugged. Okay, the impurity of false deities is of rabbinic origin. There is an allusion to it in the Torah, Genesis 35:2. Remove the foreign gods that are in your midst. Purify yourselves and change your garments. There are four primary categories of ritual impurity associated with the worship of false deities. The false deities themselves, their accessories, something offered to it, and a wine libation offered to it. The impurity associated with all of these is of rabbinic origin.
Excellent. So the two important things here is that Rambam is suggesting that unlike the previous one, or the previous two, where I said it's not entering the house itself. It's that A, people might think someone might be performing that religion which is forbidden for a Jew, or two, they might go in there and actually want to perform that act, but it's not entering the house of idolatrous worship itself. This third one, Rambam is suggesting it is, that entering into a house of worship is exposing oneself to this kind of tumah, this kind of impurity, and just being around it is forbidden. And he even says, I don't know if or someone says it elsewhere, that even looking at a house of worship might be forbidden. We'll see that actually in a later source. But Rambam says something very important. The Torah, I said, made it explicitly clear it's forbidden to perform idolatry. But what the Mishnah is talking about, entering into a house of forbidden worship, is only, Jane, if I still have you, who instituted it? Not the Torah, but the
rabbis.
The rabbis. Now, it's very important. That does not mean that then we can choose to not practice it. However, it will lead to some very important leniencies and exceptions that we have later because it's of rabbinic and not Torah origin. So again, the summary to here is it's forbidden by the Torah to perform idolatry. It's forbidden by the rabbis to enter into a house of idolatry with three possible reasons: suspicion that one might be doing it, the possibility that one might be led to do it, or it's just being exposed to it is a negative thing. And what we're
So
actually,
this
yeah, go
is
ahead,
in
Jay.
keeping with putting a fence around the Torah, that kind of thing. So being ever more stringent so that you're not led into any kind of temptation.
Well, so the second reason by Tosfot certainly is a fence around the Torah. Don't even get close to idolatry. And the rabbis use the language lehit rachek, to distance oneself, dalet amot, like 6 feet or so away from it. So that's absolutely true. This third one here is implying that just even being around it is actually bad in and of itself. And then the idea of suspicion, I don't know if it's a fence or not, but it's more that it'll create aspersions upon the person. And in fact, there's a lot of things that we're not allowed to do, even on Shabbat. We're allowed to warm food, but warming it in a regular oven, like an oven without Sabbath mode, so it looks like we're cooking, might be forbidden because it looks like we're cooking and gives the wrong idea and gives all kinds of impressions. Like if me, Rabbi Dinan, were to go into a church, people would assume that follow me, it's okay to go into a church. So I have to be aware of my actions. So I think what you said about Siag LaTorah, fence around, definitely for the second one. The first and third are a little different. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to actually jump ahead to some contemporary rulings and then look at some exceptions that I think actually help prove the rule. So Ellis, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who passed away in I think it was 1986, but in the 20th century. And he was, and in many ways still is, even though may his memory be for a blessing, he passed away, the preeminent Orthodox rabbi for rulings for American Orthodox Jews. And he was given a question, or a number of questions, about entering into houses of idolatry. But the question given to him wasn't, oh, can I just go to a church and see a service? I think it was something about renting out a side room in a church, renting a side room in a church for a program. And here is what he said in terms of, how absolute, how firm is this isur, this forbidding ruling to enter churches. So please, Ellis.
It is certainly forbidden, even if there are no images, because of the Gemara, which says, distance yourself from it. This refers to distancing yourself from heresy, Avodat Zarah 17a. There are many people trying to lure and incite Jews away from their faith, especially there in churches. To the contrary, children should be taught to keep a distance from there, and that the church is repugnant and is a repugnant and despicable place. Even if this room is needed for a Torah school, this cannot be allowed, and even for a higher price, they should find a different location for the school.
Thank you. Now, he obviously takes a very strict stance, which, by the way, we're talking here, even though we're going to talk later about how Jews view Christianity, Islam, from the perspective of idolatry itself, that makes sense, his perspective. And even though there are a few exceptions that we'll see shortly, the basic ruling that Rav Moshe gives for Orthodox Jews to just enter a church, or let's say not church, to enter a house of idolatry, that's agreed upon pretty much across the board with maybe one dissenting voice. And what's interesting here is he doesn't just bring one reason. He talks about Jews being lured away from his faith. That was the one about being led astray. He talks about it being repugnant and disgusting. And that gets to the, shkatzim, it's just this disgusting thing. The idea of what Rambam said about it being impure. Now, he doesn't talk so much here about the suspicion, and that will come back very shortly. But again, Rav Moshe is very, very clear. One can not enter a church for anything. And even though we'll see a few exceptions, it's still the basic ruling for Orthodox Jews. So Ellis, before I move on, do you have any questions or anyone else on that source?
I do have a question, and that is that, this is a very defensive type of strategy. It's in other words, if you go, you will be polluted, convinced, led astray, as opposed to if you go, you will make your own faith stronger, which is a different argument altogether. And I don't understand why from earliest times there's a very defensive thing. I can understand in the first century when people were battling over joining Christianity, but not in the later, certainly the 20th century.
So I think there's two parts to that. The Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Loew, who, even though I don't think he actually made a golem, he supposedly is famous for it. He wrote a beautiful piece I've shared before that says that Judaism should be open to all questions and all challenges. And if we don't, we push away from everything and say, no, we can't talk about that. It's a sign that our faith is not as strong. But I think there's a distinction between that and specifically going into a house of idol worship. Now, again, one of the reasons this conversation is so tricky is because it's clear that Rav Moshe probably is talking about Christianity. Now, there's two sides to that. When most of these early opinions were written, which you just suggested, and not just first century, really until,
third century, fifth century.
I'm saying until through the Crusades, for thousands of years, the relationship with Jews and Christians was such that, of course, we would understand the Jewish orientation towards Christianity to be one of, like you said, defensive, and we want nothing to do with them, and they try and lead us astray because they were. And there's still plenty of Christians today that would love to convert all the Jews. So it's important to recognize that side. However, what you're talking about is, perhaps interfaith dialogue and learning about other religions to better understand our own. Rambam does suggest that one can learn other religions, but more to understand what not to do and what to stay away from. But I think there is a value in understanding other religions and the world. But what Rav Moshe is doing here is he's responding to the rulings of thousands of years. Meaning this conversation didn't start in 1935. He has every rabbi for almost 2,000 years explicitly ruling you can't go into that place, which made sense until, and again, there's still Christians today who, and I don't think there's many of them, but there's certainly some in other religions who would happily kill the Jews or convert the Jews. But when we talk about Unitarians or loving Protestants or pastors in Milwaukee that I've gone out to coffee and have loving, great relationship with, that's not what he's talking about. And that's a very new concept. So Ellis, you are right, but this is reflecting a long, very explicit history where it was bad. So it's only starting to change now. And so we'll do this class again. And I mean that. The idea of Christianity and perhaps other religions being more comfortable entering their spaces is a very, very new concept. And that's important to validate your point, but understand where Rav Moshe, who's a traditional Orthodox rabbi, is coming from. Yeah, follow up and then we'll move on.
No, I was just going to say, it's okay. Let's move on.
Sure. I think what your question will come out when we look in the second section about defining Christianity as or not as idolatry. So this next source here, or these next two sources here, I'm going to, for time's sake, just say them outside because they're connected, and it explicitly talks about art. And this is important because one of our questions might be, well, what if I'm going into a non-Jewish house of worship, not for their worship, I'm going on a tour just to check out their art? And the Tosafot here in medieval, and then Rav Moshe explicitly ruling that it's completely forbidden for anything. And Tosafot does mention this rabbi who did, look at art from other religions, and Rav Moshe and others like him say, no. That means that if you have a piece of money that has a piece of artwork that was done by Michelangelo that happens to be in the Sistine Chapel, that's fine because it's money. But actually going into the Sistine Chapel, absolutely not. So they say that any reason for going in a church, it doesn't matter whether it's a forbidden reason to worship there or just to check out their art or listen to their music, any kind of benefit. And this is a reason I didn't mention before, is the rabbis say that one of the issues here might be benefiting from idolatry in any way, shape, or form. So to look at the Sistine Chapel, but again, this is the issue, is the way I'm saying this, it's as if I'm defining Christianity, no question, as idolatry. So let's say into the Pantheon and looking at a statue of Zeus in the Pantheon, which I don't know if that, or maybe that was whatever it is, if I'm looking at Greek statues in a Greek temple, just for the sake of art, Rav Moshe and many others would say that's explicitly forbidden. And when I went to Europe and we went to different other religions, their houses of worship, I couldn't go inside. And that's, as someone who loves art history, I'll look at it in a book, but I won't go to see it inside of a church, which is a challenge. However, one of the things that Rav Moshe does talk about is he says, he's talking about idols, etc., that are connected to their religion. So one of the questions is, what if I'm going into a non-Jewish house of worship and the thing I'm doing there has nothing to do with their religion? They have a side room where they're having a used record sale, and I really want the new Beatles album they have a great price on. Nothing to do with the religion. In fact, it's not even hosted by this religious institution. It's by a different party. So none of that money in any way is going even indirectly to their church. They're letting the space used for free. So is there permission to go into a church for something which has nothing to do with them? And by the way, most cases, when a quartet or an orchestra rents out space from a church, they are paying the church. So to say that that money doesn't support that religious institution is a tough sell. But let's look at exceptions that might allow us to go into a church. So the easiest one here, and Rita, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. This is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, probably the most authoritative commentary, one of the most authoritative ones. The Shach, short for Siftei Cohen, I think it was Rav Shabtai Cohen, so it was just a cute play on his name, from Lithuania. And he talks about one that I think we would all assume. So go ahead, source number 1 there. Rita, please.
In case of danger, it's permitted to enter a house of idolatrous worship. It's certainly permitted when there is danger, because the issue here is only mar it ayin, what the eye perceived.
Excellent. This source is important for 2 reasons. One is it says if there's a life and death reason, whether it's, sanctuary, and there's Jews in a town and the only safe place they can go is in a church, of course they can go in. Because, and this is key, the Shach rules that the reason we don't enter into houses of other religions is not because of impurity or being led astray, but because others might get the wrong idea. And that's a rabbinic injunction. So if it's life and death, it's rabbinic, so we can throw that away. But the other point is, what if there's a way to enter into a house of worship in which everyone knows that we're going there not to partake in their worship, but for another purpose altogether? So that leads to the second source, to a contemporary rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch in Yerushalayim, who's a Haredi rabbi, but his rulings really ripple out into all Orthodox communities. And someone said, I think it was in Johannesburg, there's an election coming up, it's in a church, and the way the question seems to have been asked is, it's too late to ask them to hold it somewhere else because it's forbidden to go into churches. But I need to vote down apartheid or something like that. I think this was after that. Can I go into a church? So let's go to Leonard and Gloria. I'm going to unmute you again. And Gloria, if you would take this source on, can I go into a side room in a church? And he uses the phrase side hall. Explicitly, it's not in their sanctuary. That's very important for him. Can I vote? Go for it.
We do not enter to a house of idolatry, as is stated explicitly in Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah 150, that it is a mitzvah to distance oneself for amot from a path to idolatry. But according to what the questioner pointed out, the use of the connected hall is for all kinds of meetings and conferences that have nothing to do with their idolatry. It appears that in this case, we don't need to be strict after the fact, since it's clear from the start, this hall is for a special non-idolatrous purpose. This hall is not called an entrance to idolatry. It's permitted to vote in this hall, which is designated for voting on this day, and we are only entering for this purpose, and we don't need to forbid it.
Excellent, thank you. Before I explain this, just an important side note is on almost every ruling here, other than well, actually really every ruling, whether it's permitted or forbidden, there's always different opinions. So I personally, Rav Moshe Sternbruch is a heavy hitter, so I personally hold by him, but there's certainly those who might disagree. But his language is very clear. He says later in this, if it was possible to have told the voting people, please don't hold it in a church, it's really not okay for Jews to go there, that would have been ideal. But now it's too late, it's after the fact, bediavad, they would say in Hebrew Aramaic. So in that case, it's okay to go in because the issue here is chashad, marit ayin. It's not being led astray, and it's not the impurity of it. That idea is basically, both of those kind of fall by the wayside. So in this case, for example, at one of our local churches, where I voted in the recent elections, Plymouth Church, if you go there on the day of elections, there's like 7 trillion signs that say, vote here, go in this door, vote here, go in this door. And it's not only a side door, so it's clearly not their main sanctuary, it's clearly marked, it's for a totally non-religious secular purpose, but the side hall that they have it in, forget about it not being their main sanctuary, there's a Jewish minyan, there's a shul that rents out that space. So Rabbi Sternbruch might say, ideally it wouldn't be in there, but certainly if that's the place to vote, then it's okay to go there. But this is so important because, again, the matter is not inherently going into a house of worship, it's people getting the wrong idea. And if we have time at the end, I'll mention some leniencies that not everyone would agree on, but logical leniencies that would come out of this. Another possible leniency, again, where people probably wouldn't get the wrong idea because they would all know why this person is going in there, but there's a greater reason is, what if a great leader in another religion passes away or is being installed as a president or a leader, and it's very important for the head rabbi of a city, this makes more sense in Europe than here in the States, to make an appearance. So the former chief rabbi, Emanuel Jakobovits, who wrote in the 20th century in England, talks about this explicitly. He writes, he has a collection of his letters, and he talks about going into a church for the sake of Darchei Shalom, creating positive relationships between the communities. So Leonard, if you would please take this letter from former Chief Rabbi Emanuel Jakobovits.
After consultation and so on?
Yeah.
Okay. After consultation with the London Beit Din, my own practice is occasionally to attend church services on royal and state occasions to represent the Jewish community. But I never actively participate, nor do I wear a cap and gown. I find that my Christian hosts usually show understanding and respect for this attitude and its reservations. Naturally, I often face the problem of having to respond to invitations to take part in interfaith services, sometimes at the highest level for royal and national events. My attitude invariably is that I cannot take an active part in a religious service of any except my own faith. And this is always understood and respected. But I do, on occasions, attend such services as a representative of the Jewish community, though without wearing canonicals or officiating in any other form.
Excellent, thank you. Now, many Orthodox rabbis push against this, although this is the official position of the London Beit Din, which is, again, like a heavy hitter and very respected. But one of the reasons that people push back is there's 2 issues with someone going into one of these services, these installations or these state funerals. So the one about suspicion, marit ayin, what it appears like, this rabbi explicitly said, I make sure that I don't wear my formal robes. Everyone knows I'm not there in a religious capacity. I'm there as an onlooker out of respect, not for their religious things, but for the person who we're honoring or remembering here. So that one, it's easy enough to get out of, and we'll talk more about that in a second. However, the rabbis are clear on 2 reasons that we have to get around to be able to enter into a church, other than there has to be some reason to go there in the first place. One is marit ayin, and the second is it has to be in a side room that is not used for idolatrous purposes. So I mentioned the, going into a side room for voting, but typically this rabbi is talking about going into the sanctuary. So if we want to talk about going into concerts, into a house of idolatry, if there were 4 million signs, which often there are, saying there was a concert on that night, then one could say the issue of chashad, of suspicion, marit ayin, might be dealt with, but it can't be held in the sanctuary. So there is no accepted rabbi. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't rabbis who say this, who I have a lot of respect for, but there's no accepted rabbi, generally across the board that would say that if it's clearly marked, and it's in a side room, that one can go into a church for a concert. Certainly everyone, including myself, would rule that if it's in the sanctuary, it is forbidden. So is there room to say that if a concert is in a side hall, like if a church has a room for specifically concerts of all religions and all kinds of programs, and it's unbelievably clear that anyone going there is going for the concert, is there room to say one could be permitted to go there? Yes. Is there room for it to happen in the sanctuary? The answer is pretty much no, except for something we'll see near the very end. So one of the first questions is, can one see a concert in a church? The simple answer is no. Maybe if it's in a side room, almost certainly not if it's in the sanctuary. Are there other things that we can go into a church for? Certainly life and death. And if it's a side room and it's for voting and there's no other option, then there's a lot of people who would permit it. And you could apply this logic to everything across the board. Bake sales, although I don't think it would be kosher, but all kinds of different situations you could apply that logic for. So the default is to never enter into a church. So my personal practice, and many Orthodox Jews just won't ever go into a church, with those very, very few exceptions that not everyone agrees upon. So that's section 1. So we'll pause there, and then we should have enough time to get through the last section. So again, I'm just going to wait a moment, look through and see if anyone raising their hands. And those who are on the phone, I will unmute at the end of the class, everyone. And if you have questions now, either write them down or remember them. We'll get them then. Jane, and you're going to read next, so I'm also unmuting you.
Okay. I'm just thinking of a JC, I don't know if it was a JCRC or a Federation program that I went to at Plymouth Church maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that was about Israeli and Arab West Bankers who have a dialogue going. And the Israeli was an Orthodox rabbi, and it was in the church sanctuary.
Oh, interesting.
It was interesting, and I think he was American born, but he's living in a settlement in the West Bank, and it did take place in the sanctuary. So obviously, not everybody follows that.
So there's two things. If you had said it was in the side room, I would say there's certainly evidence for that. However, the idea of it being in the sanctuary, we'll see a source at the end. And one of the important things here is, again, and I'm doing this not to diminish Christianity, because I have a lot, respect for them as a religion certainly today, and a lot of personal historical anger at what Christians did to Jews for thousands of years, the Crusades, etc. So I have that tension, but Christianity is not default idolatry today. In almost all of the sources that we saw, certainly the medieval ones, it was assumed, and we're actually going to see a very interesting emendation that reflects that tension between how Jews view Christianity. And the way Christianity is viewed today, what I mentioned to you, Ellis, is it's not clear. So the rabbi that you're talking about, Jane, probably him going to the sanctuary reflects some of that, those nuances and how we view Christianity. And ultimately what it gets down to is, why don't we go into churches? And the truth is, it might not matter if the religion is idolatrous, because a Jew is not allowed to be a Christian. I can have dinner with, do business with, be friends with. I can't marry, though, and can't do the religion of Christianity, can't do the religious rites, because it's different than Judaism. So there's a distinction, like I said, between idolatry and things that are forbidden to Jews.
Another situation I'm thinking about is volunteering in a soup kitchen that takes place in a church. It's obviously not in the sanctuary, but
yeah. I think in Baltimore, I actually dropped off food in a soup kitchen and had a separate side entrance And everyone knew that was the soup kitchen entrance, and it was just a kitchen. There was nothing else done in that room but kitchening. So again, it's not a clear answer on that, but again, we have the tools to apply. Is it in the sanctuary? And we'll look at later about what, is there a difference between different kinds of sanctuaries? And is the thing that I'm doing permitted in of itself? And are people going to get the wrong idea? If I pull my car up to the soup kitchen, people usually aren't going to think I'm going to worship God in a forbidden way. Ellis, and then we'll move on. Ellis, you are now unmuted.
I was just going to say that, again, it seems very defensive. And I'm talking about, taking an argument, for example, during the Inquisition, of course, with the jury not being rigged against you, but having rabbis expound on the value of their Jewish faith in a real dialogue. And in the 20th century, following the establishment of the State of Israel, it seemed as though that shifted dramatically, and people were much more willing to violate this specific prohibition to argue the validity of the faith.
No, it's very important. And again, what we'll see, especially in the last sources, and this is the conversation here is really shifting into Christianity. And that's the one we've been dealing with all along, because most people don't ask the rabbis, can I go into a Greek church to watch them pour libations out for Zeus? By the way, these exceptions above would apply there, if it's life or death, or if the voting happens to be in a side room and when I say Greek church, Greek church usually means Christianity, but what I mean, like those who worship Zeus and Athenian church, etc. And Jane, I'm going to mute you because I'm having you read. But Ellis, everything you're saying is very alive in the conversation, and I think will start to come out in one of our last sources. And the default since the Crusades really has been, like you said, defensive. And by the way, Rav Moshe and Rav Soloveitchik both were opposed to being on, having interfaith dialogues, at least like explicitly, certainly Rav Moshe, because, certainly they didn't see a value in it, but they came from a world where Christians just want to convert us or kill us. Why would we even bother having anything to do with them? Whereas today, this conversation really certainly has shifted. And as with all Jewish law, it takes a while to catch up. But the fact that all the rabbis agree the issue is suspicion and it's rabbinic, there is certainly room for development and growth, as Jane, you already mentioned. So the first one we'll take is just very easy, and that's Islam. There are a few people, there's one rabbi in Israel who disagrees with this, but pretty much across the board, everyone agrees with Rav Ovadia Yosef, who was the chief rabbi of Israel for many years, and one of the most brilliant and prolific Sephardic authors to walk the face of the earth. So he rules based on Rambam and others. Go for it.
It seems that the mosques of the Arabs do not have the status of a house of idol worship, and it is permitted to enter them. Even with regard to the
Ran, which is short for Rabbeinu Nisim, again, an earlier, I think, Catalonian rabbi,
who stated that since they bow to them, their prophets, in a manner of worship of a deity, they have the status of idol worshippers. One could argue that if the Ran were to have heard about all that the Rambam wrote in his responsa, he would not have held that way. For certainly the Rambam was a much greater expert regarding them, and no secret was hidden from him. And that which the Tosafot wrote, Megillah 6a, that it is difficult to say that it is permitted to learn Torah there, that it is only with regard to actual houses of idol worship, but with regard to the mosques of the Ishmaelites, where there is no idolatry whatsoever, even Tosafot would agree that it is permitted to learn and pray there. This is the primary opinion, and I have written what I believe is true.
Excellent. So one of the beauties of Rav Ovadia Yosef's Tshuvot is he brings in everything. He had an incredible memory and access to so many books. So he brings in this Rabbeinu Nisim, who mentioned an issue that perhaps Muslims, because the way they treat their prophet Muhammad almost with godlike status, which I don't know, but I don't think that's true. But even if they did, he says, no, that was rejected by Rambam, who's more authoritative in this case, and even Tosafot, who says, who brings something about not setting Torah in houses of worship that some thought was talking about Islamic mosques. He says, no, they only talked about real houses of idolatry. But Rav Ovadia Yosef is explicit. a mosque is permitted. In practice, a lot of rabbis would say, it's permitted to go into a mosque if there is a need to, and the threshold for entering is far lower. So if one wants to go for an event of, let's say after what happened in Pittsburgh, and wanted to show, communal, coming together, and it happened to be in a mosque, that would be a reason that certainly no one would have suspicion. It would permit beautiful communal relations. If one wanted to go to an art show they were having there, that's fine. To just show up for no reason, the rabbis are iffy on that, but really it's permitted. Islam is fine. It's completely monotheistic. And the way that they worship the one true God is, even though a Jew can't be a Muslim, the way that they do it, there's nothing wrong with it. They are our monotheistic brothers and sisters. And the fact that he calls them Yishmaelim, which goes back to the idea that Yitzchak, Isaac's brother, Ishmael, ultimately became the Arab nations who became Islam. The idea is that even though we often, unfortunately, fight with them, we recognize that they are still our brothers, and we have that same, holy stock, as it were. Now Christianity. And there are a few different perspectives on it. So the first one is the Rambam's, and again, for time's sake, we don't need to go into all this because he's talking about a law that we'll talk about next week, I believe, about just going out to a bar and drinking with non-Jews, and why the rabbis forbade that in certain cases. But ultimately he rules, and you see here in the bottom, actually in the Hebrew, in the right column, Aval, the second to last line, Aval otam ha'ovdim, skip the parentheses, akum stam yenam. But he says those idolaters who, or those, those worshipers who are idolaters, et cetera, et cetera. Originally, he didn't call them idolaters. He called them notzrim, which is the Hebrew for Christians. So the original text of the Rambam that was then edited for lots of obvious reasons, originally was very explicit that Christianity is forbidden and considered idolatry. That is opinion number one. Opinion number two is a unique stance. And again, I'll summarize this one because, the technical language you get lost in, which is based on a Tosafist named Rabbeinu Tam. That's probably his nickname. And what he says is that when Christians, and this really is Catholics, oftentimes most of these rabbis, when they say Christians, they don't mean Protestants, Unitarians, Calvinists, they mean Catholics. That when they talk about the Trinity, the shituf, the joining together, that is a forbidden form of worshiping the one true God of the Torah for Jews, but it might be permitted it is permitted according to him for them. Some people disagree with exactly what he meant, but the consensus is that Tosafot is saying that a Jew can't believe in the Trinity. A Jew can't be a Christian, but a Christian can be a Christian. Why is that important? Because Christians aren't idolaters. They are worshiping God in a way that's not allowed for us. It's like saying that, Christians don't have to keep kosher. Of course they don't. Only Jews have to keep kosher. So Tosafot is very, very important to the conversation of Christianity. However, he would still probably say we can't go into their churches because they're not idolaters, but the way that they worship God is forbidden, and therefore going into their houses of worship, there's still that chashad, that suspicion that one might be worshiping the Trinity. So even though Tosafot has taken Christianity out of the realm of idolatry, they are brothers and sisters, there's nothing evil, it's totally fine for them to worship God that way, it's great. I've heard this from a lot of Orthodox rabbis, beautiful what they do. We're not allowed to go into a church. Everything we read in the first section still holds because we don't want people to think that we're worshiping, Jesus or the Holy Ghost or the Father, et cetera, like that. So in terms of relations, what you talked about, Ellis, this is even though this is quite old, now this is medieval, it's a big step in the right direction towards normalizing respect for relations. However, the issue with not going into churches is not about, oh, they're evil idolaters. It's, why can't I go into an IHOP? No one thinks IHOP is evil and it's bad for people to go to IHOP. But I keep kosher, so I can't go into an IHOP. And I think that's a much healthier, positive way to see it. But then we go, and I do want to read this inside because this is beautiful. This Rabbi Menachem Meiri from 13th century Catalan, he wrote a lot, much of his writings, were passed down through generations for understanding the Talmud, but a lot of his writings were lost. And he wrote a very explicit, beautiful statement on how we define idolatry and what would be forbidden in terms of entering churches, doing business with. His opinion was lost and found only in the last couple decades. And because of that, no one had ruled based on the Meiri until maybe 15 years ago. So had this source been available when it was written in the 13th century, what you talked about, Ellis, would have been a very different conversation, because the way he talks about other religions is much more positive and constructive. In fact, Ellis, maybe I'll have you read then the Meiri. Go for it.
Okay. We have seen many people who are astounded that nowadays no one is the least bit careful regarding these prohibitions. And we have already explained the primary intention of this work, i.e. the Gemara, regarding which nations it is referring to, as is evident in the phrase, the holidays, that the nations are all those early nations that were not constrained by religious norms and cleaved to and were persistent in their worship of idols, stars, and talismans. For all these things and similar matters are the essence of idolatry, as has been explained.
Excellent, thank you. So what he says is, when we talk about idolatry, remember when I started the classes, there are different ways to perceive idolatry. It's either that which is forbidden to us, or it's just something which is inherently evil we have to wipe out, certainly in the land of Israel, but stay away from. And the Meiri says the Gemara is talking about that idolatry, the Canaanites. If there were descendants of the Canaanites or the Amalekites that set up a church in Milwaukee, we would not be obligated to smash it, because it's not the land of Israel, but it would certainly be forbidden to go there unless it was for voting or life and death situations. But all of these rulings, the whole first section, only applies, according to the Meiri, or at least those who understand him this way, only applies to those nations which aren't around anymore. So, by the way, a church that worships Zeus and Athena and Apollo, etc., might fall into that category. But Christianity and Islam and perhaps even Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, those would not fall in that category. Now, again, the Meiri was not as widely available as other sources were, so it was not used for rulings. There are indeed rabbis today who say it's fine to go into a church or in certain house of worship because the Meiri wrote. Well, they can only do that because they found the Meiri recently. So the Meiri is a very important part of the conversation, but he has not yet become mainstream in different rulings. If he did, then interfaith things, music in churches, even going to a church service just to check it out. Again, it's not permission to worship with the other religions, but normalizing relations completely, the way that there are Christian groups who will visit our synagogue, come on a weekday just to ask about it, that it would be permitted for Jewish groups to do the same curious dialogue, learning about other religions, if the Meiri was more widespread. So Ellis, literally there are rabbis today, 1 or 2 opinions that use the Meiri. 10 years, 20 years, it will become much more widespread. So there's a lot of hope, but thinking about the halachic process, just because we discovered him now, we don't automatically overturn 500, 1,000 years of halachic rulings. And then actually, I think, just want to see if there's another source. No, good. So I think that's the last one then. So this last source, I believe his last source here, is one of my favorite rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin, living in Yerushalayim. He wrote this incredible work of Tshuvot Shut B'nai Vanim. And these are, again, very contemporary issues. And I, except for a few other people in maybe the East Coast, he probably is the only real modern Orthodox posek in the world. And again, there are other rabbis who say, wait, what about me? So I don't diminish them, but like a real posek who's really writing halachic opinions, Rabbi Henkin is certainly one of the few, if not the only one. And I'll take this last source, and he actually brings an incredibly nuanced view that goes back not to Christianity being idolatry, but gets into the ground with Christianity is not idolatry. That's already been dealt with. But the idea of this suspicion of when we can go into spaces and people think we might be worshiping in that forbidden way, so I can never go into a church to look at the art or listen to music. So he says, the root of idolatry is the physicality of God. I am rejecting it. The idea that you can have a statue and that's God. No, no, no. And all this, the emphasis on images and idols, exists in Catholic and Orthodox and Anglican Christianity. So again, he's using the language of idolatry here. So perhaps he's implying that, but he continues, but since Luther, Protestant churches have abandoned the prostration to images. And in their case, even the image of Jesus on the cross is not an idol. And in fact, rabbis, Orthodox Jews have pictures of rabbis to help, connect them with their faith. Nevertheless, most Protestant churches believe in the Trinity and perform the Mass. And since they accept Jesus upon themselves as a God, it is forbidden to enter into their churches. So he's moved, he said some Christians might fall into classical idolatry. That's A. B, some Christians are not idolaters, but the way in which they worship God through Jesus and the Trinity is forbidden for Jews. So the issue of suspicion would mean we can't even go into Protestant churches. So he gives a very limited ruling. He continues, and only the Unitarians and a few other denominations do not believe in the divinity of Jesus, and their churches are not houses of idolatry, and it is permitted to enter into them. I think I do have one more page here. Hold on. There we go. Okay. During the time, so he says, even if it's permitted to go into them, still not in the time of worship, just as it is permitted to enter into a mosque. So I can't go to a mosque to pray with them during their prayer time. I can enter into it for almost any other reason. And so too with the Christian Unitarians. Nevertheless, one should not do such because of suspicion, because people do not distinguish between one type of church and another. So he broke Christianity into three groups. Real idolatry. Now, I think we've seen enough sources to say Christianity probably isn't idolatry, but let's say you do have that category of pure idolatry. The first section of the class absolutely applies to any real form of idolatry. Then there's a middle group that are, everyone agrees are not idolaters, but the way that they worship God is totally forbidden, and it's still not permitted to go into their churches, even for a concert, like the first section, only for voting, to save a life, etc., because anyone who sees us go in there might think, chashad, have a suspicion that we're going to worship in their way. Then there's a third group of religious institutions where it's clear that they're monotheists. They don't have imagery, iconoclasm, etc. like that. Now he says that with mosques, or he says with all those, don't go when they're having their services, because we don't want any. That would be definitely a problem. We're still not allowed to be Muslim. But with mosques, it was ruled that we could certainly go in there any other time. But here it's interesting. He says it really probably would be permitted to go into Unitarian church, but he says something which is true. I don't know the distinctions between all Christian groups, and most people don't either. So he rules that technically it might be okay to enter into a Unitarian church to see a classical music concert, even in their sanctuary, not during services, but don't do it because the issue of chashad is still ascendant. So the takeaway from all of this class is ultimately, if I am entering into an actual house of worship, I can never do it. But for Christian houses of worship, I can only enter if there's going to be if there's a reason to enter that's not participating in the religion, and it's 100% clear to anyone who sees me that I'm entering in for some other reason. And the third reason that the rabbis sort of add on is that it really can't be in the sanctuary because of iconoclastic imagery. So back to your point, Jane, I've not been in Plymouth's sanctuary. So by the way, it doesn't mean that they can't have any imagery of Jesus, but if their sanctuary were filled to the brim with saints and God and Sistine Chapel, like things like that, it would be very hard for that rabbi to argue why it was permitted to be in there. But if their space is pretty neutral and there's only a few images of Jesus here and there, then one could argue, that might be okay. So that's where we're going to